Hey there, this is Dr. Anna Maria Helt and a whole hell of a lot of dogs. I'm dog sitting on top of my own 2.5 dogs. Anyway, this is a video that I decided to do on mushroom identification because I've gotten some questions over the past months, especially with our ripon mushroom season here in the Rockies, about mushroom identification. And I've had a couple of people bring up the use of photos in identifying mushrooms. And while pictures are helpful, you can't rely on pictures for mushroom identification. Look at them, but they can be misleading. There are a lot of steps actually that go into mushroom identification that, yes, the pictures can be helpful for, but lots of other things that you need to pay attention to. So that's the point of this video, is steps to take to make sure you're not making yourself sick inadvertently while you're out hunting mushrooms. So it's mushroom season somewhere. It might seem a little late for those of us here in the Rockies. So let me see. What do I want to get into? Let's just jump right into it. So one way to get to know mushrooms, aside from pictures, is to go on local forays. So look at events pages in your locality to see if somebody is leading a mushroom foray. It's something I do sometimes. There are other people around where I live that do this as well. Look to local experts. Sometimes if there's a university or a college nearby, there might be a mushroom expert there who can be helpful to hook up with, to meet, to find out if they're willing to help you identify a mushroom that you've found and are curious about. Find somebody. My first experience in mushroom foraging was way back, quarter of a century ago, in grad school. And so one of the other students in the program had been harvesting mushrooms for many years, and he took a bunch of us out chanterelle hunting. So chanterelles were the first wild mushrooms that I ever harvested, and the first wild edible mushrooms that I'd ever eaten, and they are delicious. So we found chanterelles on this foray, and we found cauliflower mushrooms on this foray, and that really got us all fired up who were new to this whole mushrooming thing. And so another way to go when you're wanting to learn your local mushrooms, especially if you plan to stick any of them in your mouth, which can be deadly if you make a mistake, look up your local mycological society. So North America itself has a mycological society. Many states have a state-level mycological society, and you can get even more local than that. So for instance, the Bay Area Mycological Society, or where I am, the Four Corners Mycological Society. And these societies are going to provide a wealth of information, a lot of mushroom geeks and experts and such that you can access through these mycological societies. And even more and more now online, there are groups you can join, and even very specialized groups like elite groups, for instance, where you can learn about mushrooms and get help with mushroom identification, because mushroom ID is absolutely critical if you're planning on doing anything with that mushroom. And it's also just fun, even if your goal is to just hang out with that mushroom and look at it or take a picture of it or what have you. Have a few local guidebooks on hand. So I just told you that pictures aren't sufficient for making a positive ID. They can be helpful. They're fun to look at, but a good guidebook will have lots of other descriptors about the mushroom, not just the picture. It'll talk about the size, the colors, all the other stuff that I'm going to get into momentarily. So I have a handful of books for where I am. I'm in Colorado, so here's Vera Stuckey Evanson's Mushrooms of Colorado. Here is an even more recent one from her, Mushrooms of the Rocky Mountain region. Here's a really cool one that I like that's even more recent, that she co-authored with Michael Quo and Kathy Cripps. What's neat about this one, if you are in the Rocky Mountains, is that they break the book down based on habitat, which is kind of neat. So if you happen to be in, say, the aspen belt or aspen fir belt, in terms of elevation and habitat, you can open up that chapter of the book and see what mushrooms you can expect to find in that area. I got this somewhat more recently. Myco cards. These are great. So this is boletes of Western North America. They're kind of flashcards basically. So get a few good guidebooks specific to your region and use them as resources. Cross-check things there. Now, let's see, what else did I want to mention? Local guidebooks. Oh, and then look to well-respected websites. You might learn trusted people who talk about mushrooms online, even here on YouTube. But there's some great sites like mushroomexpert.com, which is Michael Kuo. There's MycoWeb as well. There is Tom Volk's site, which is, if you just do a search for Volk, V-O-L-K, and mushrooms, you'll find his site. It's through a university in the Midwest. So there are some great sites that are put up and curated by mushroom experts. That's another good resource to go to as well. So many resources go into identifying a mushroom. Before you do anything with that mushroom, you should really get to know it, find it out in its habitat. Well, I'm getting a lot of practice with this section. First, I accidentally deleted it before I put everything together, and this time all of the dogs decided to bark at once. So hopefully 3's a charm. So this section's a chance for me to show off all my mushroom photos as well. Anyway, back to identification. Another great way to learn mushrooms is to attend classes and workshops. Go to mushroom festivals. I used to love going to the Santa Cruz Mushroom Festival when I lived on that side of the continent. And a lot of the stuff there was free, which was great for me at the moment. Closer to where I live now, about 2 hours away, is the Telluride Mushroom Festival, which happens in August. And so this is a whole bunch of mushroom experts and mushroom nerds coming together to teach classes and eat mushroom dishes and go on forays and identify mushrooms. So when you go to a wild mushroom workshop or one of these conferences or these festivals, often there'll be a table or tables like the one you're seeing here with a bunch of fresh mushrooms on it. And so this is from my mushroom workshop that I taught in August with a whole bunch of different mushrooms I found during the few days before the conference. This table had been sitting out for a couple days by the time I thought to take a picture of what was on it. But essentially, different species of mushrooms with their botanical name and their common name listed on the plates that are holding the mushrooms. So this is a really good way to get up close and personal with your local mushrooms to learn them, much better than simply looking at pictures. So appearance is obviously an important way to identify mushrooms, but like I said, you can't just rely on a picture, even though I'm showing you pretty ones here. They can be deceiving. Different aspects of mushroom appearance can shift. Let me just pause for a moment though and make it clear that when I refer to mushroom, what I'm actually talking about, kind of colloquially, whatever. What I'm referring to here are the sex parts of the mushrooms. So these things you're seeing here are how the fungus itself reproduces. And the fungal individual, as it were, is what's living inside the growth substrate, whether it's in the soil, in a dying tree, in a pile of horse manure, whatever. That's where the fungus itself lives. And then these things here that we're calling mushrooms are how that fungus reproduces. It's, the fruiting body that it sends out. And this is where the spores are made, the gametes, basically the seeds of the mushrooms, and are released and dispersed. So mushrooms, fruiting bodies, this is what we're usually harvesting when we're talking about mushroom hunting. So appearance is important. A good guidebook will talk about the variation in the appearance of different mushrooms. And again, you can really get up close and personal, like I said, at one of those festivals, and simply from going out and getting familiar with what's in your area. So the shape is important here. You're seeing very dramatically different shapes here of fruiting bodies of mushrooms. We've got a few of them that are your typical kind of cap and stalk mushrooms that most people are familiar with, even if it's just from grocery store button mushrooms. In the upper left here, we have an agaricus species, which is a wild cousin of button mushrooms with its cap and its stalk and my dirty fingers. And then below that, we have the iconic fly agaric or Amanita muscaria with its red cap and white spots. Next to that, we have a fat Rocky Mountain red bolete, Boletus rubriceps, a delicious local mushroom here in the Rockies. But you can see the cap shape is all different. The stalk size and shape is different. In the center top, we have a conch, a shelf fungus. This is Ganoderma applanatum. It's a hard woody fungus that sticks out from the side of stumps and dying or dead trees. Completely different shape, no stalk. Next to that, we have two giant western puffball mushrooms that are like abnormally shaped soccer balls, and they can be huge. No stalk with these either. They're just basically blobs, Calvatia booniana. Below the big puffballs is a coral mushroom, beautiful yellowish orange, Ramaria largentii, or largentii. Sorry about my Latin. And you can see perhaps why this is called a coral mushroom. So the mushroom shapes are amazing. They vary widely. Now, color is another way to help identify a mushroom, and color can be in terms of, the cap here in the case of mushrooms that have caps. The stalks, as you're seeing, can sometimes be completely different color from the cap. Color can mean a lot of different things, or I should say it can refer to a lot of different parts of the mushroom, whether the whole mushroom itself, like the coral mushroom, the whole thing is kind of yellowish orange. But if you look at the bolete, the middle bottom, you'll see that the cap is a reddish color, the stalk is not. But the one thing, or many things, but one of the things you do need to pay attention to with respect to color is that it can vary within the species. This is Boletus rubriceps here. Both of these are Rocky Mountain red boletes. The one on the left, this stunning burgundy color looking down at the top of the cap, was a fruiting body that was hanging out, more in the shade. You'll find these actually along openings in the woods, maybe along paths and such, where it's part shade, part sun. So this one on the left is not quite as sun faded. The one on the right, actually the photo on the right was taken just after a rain, so it looks a little slimier. The cap's wetter because it was a wet day, and it's a lighter color. You'll even see some yellowish color on the cap. That's from the sun fading the mushroom and from the mushroom being exposed to weather. That will change the color, so that's something you need to pay attention to. Another feature in terms of mushroom identification is size. So here is my loyal sidekick Milo, the rat dog, next to two completely different species of puffball mushrooms. So on the right, we have Calvatia booniana, giant western puffball. This thing weighed almost as much as Milo did, and Milo wasn't quite so sure about it when he approached it, and then decided he was the boss and was about ready to pee on it. But luckily I rescued the mushroom and was able to cook it and use it in different recipes. On the left, just for scale, is Milo with a completely different species of puffball. And in fact, that little puffball is barely the size of Milo's nose. This is not a giant western puffball. Yeah. Now, size also does pertain to things like a stalk, for instance, or the cap, depending on the structure of the mushroom. Now, when it comes to things like color and size and even shape, growth stage is very relevant with respect to the fruiting body. So when you're out poking around in a meadow or in the woods or on a golf course or wherever you are, look around to see if you can see different specimens of the same species at different growth stages. So what you're seeing here is fly agaric, again, Amanita muscaria. You're seeing a fairly mature fruiting body in the middle, that beautiful bright red cap with a white stalk. And then when you look north of that, on top of that in the picture, you're seeing some that are just emerging out of the ground, and their color's different, right? They still have some of what's known as the universal membrane surrounding them, this white membrane that the little baby mushroom grows inside of. They look completely different. If you see, and I'm not showing you right now, some even earlier stage fly agarics, they'll even look kind of yellowish right as they're emerging from the ground. Now, ultimately, as these fly agaric fruiting bodies grow, that cap will expand out bigger and bigger. It'll look more like an umbrella, and then eventually almost like a tabletop where it flattens out rather than being round like the ones you're seeing here. So growth stage is also important here. It's very educational when you're out hiking around to see if you can find a bunch of the mushroom you're interested in different growth stages. Why am I getting into this so much? Because you could make yourself really sick or really dead if you pick the wrong mushroom. You do not want to ever skimp on mushroom identification. And while zillions and zillions of people go mushroom foraging for edible and medicinal mushrooms each year, and relative to that, there aren't that many deaths annually, but there are indeed deaths annually from people misidentifying mushrooms. So this is important. This is why I'm blathering on here about all of this. Something else that is used for mushroom identification is looking at where the spores are made and released. The spores, the gametes, the seeds, as it were, of the mushrooms. Where are they made and released? So many people are familiar with gilled mushrooms if they eat button mushrooms or portobellos, which, by the way, are the same species, Agaricus bisporus. So here's a wild agaricus again in the upper left. That is a gilled mushroom. It has gills underneath the cap. This is where the spores are made, and this is where they come out of. Next to that agaricus in the top middle is an adorable little lion's mane mushroom that I grew from a kit. This is a so-called toothed mushroom, little teeth. The spores are made here and released here. Hawkswing is a local species here in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado and in many other places as well. That's another toothed mushroom, and you may have heard of hedgehog mushrooms as well, which is a toothed mushroom. Now moving over to the right, the upper right corner, we have a polypore mushroom. The artist conch, Ganoderma applanatum, I showed you earlier, is another polypore mushroom. What you're seeing here is a photo of the bottom of a different one, though. This is red-belted conch, Fomitopsis shrinkii, in my neighborhood. And if you have really good eyes or a magnifying glass and look closely at this, you'll see a bunch of tiny, tiny little holes in the underside of this fruiting body, this conch, this shell fungus. That's basically kind of a diagnostic or identifying feature of this mushroom, but also of other polypore mushrooms. At the bottom left, we have a sideways morel. And so the hole you're seeing on the left is where the rest of the stalk would have been before I chopped it. And then the cap, it's kind of pointing sideways. Morels release their spores from these pits on the surface of the cap. So rather than dropping them from underneath the cap, like with the agaricus above it, it's coming from the surface of the cap. And then here's our coral mushroom again on the bottom right, that, completely different structure in terms of where the spores are released from these aerial parts that are sticking up. So all of these are important identifiers of the mushrooms you're looking at. Now coming back to gilled mushrooms, there are a lot of gilled mushrooms out there. People will look at the color of those gills, and you'll see just in these examples, it's varying widely from yellow to pink to white. They can be dark brown. They can be all kinds of colors, depending on the species we're talking about. Gill structure is important. If you look at this grisette, an Amanita species, in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see some wavy little structure, kind of where the gills hit the edge of the cap. People use that for identification. You will see that the spacing or the number of gills varies, so that agaricus mushroom on the upper left and with the pinkish gills and this floccularia, funky looking yellow species in the top middle have, there are a lot of gills there. They're somewhat tightly packed. In contrast, if you look at the lower right, these bright white oyster mushrooms, aspen oysters, or you look at the lower left corner, this is an Amanita species, you'll see that the gills are instead maybe not quite so plentiful and a little bit further apart. And then just to throw you off, in the bottom center is the bottom part of a lovely chanterelle, Cantharellus. And these are false gills. They're not even considered real gills. Some other things people will look at is whether or not the gills are attached to the stalk or not. Do they actually connect to the stalk, or are they free from the stalk? Do they run down the stalk, as is the case with the oyster mushrooms you see on the bottom right? The gills actually go right onto the stalk. So just some other things that people will look at to help them identify what they are looking at. Now, there are other various structural features that people use for mushroom identification. So on the left here is another beautiful wild agaricus species, and on the stalk, so the stalk's sticking out to the right, confusing picture here, this mushroom's already been picked. You'll see a ring or an annulus around the stalk, kind of like a little skirt on the stalk. This is a structural feature that is used to identify mushrooms. Many species of amanitas have a ring around the stalk. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. So this center picture here is an amanita, and it has, this one in particular, has kind of a wimpy ring around the stalk. It's above my thumb and below the pointer finger. Not as prominent as this other mushroom on the left. Both of these rings in these different species of mushrooms come from something called the universal veil. I mentioned that earlier. It is a membrane that the little baby mushroom is developing within. And as the fruiting body or mushroom starts to grow, it pops out of that membrane. And sometimes remnants of that membrane stick to the mushroom, in this case, sticking to the stalk. Now, in the case of the agaricus mushroom, this pink gilled one on the left, you'll see some kind of white fringe around the edge of the cap. Those are also bits of veil remnants, structural things that are used to help identify that species of mushroom. Another place that veil remnants will show up in certain mushrooms, especially a number of the amanita species out there, is in the vulva or cup at the base of a stalk. So coming back to the mushroom in the middle panel again, there's this bulbous shape at the bottom of the stalk that is also encased in the vulva or a cup. It is, again, part of what's left of that veil that the mushroom originally developed in. And that's a very important distinguishing feature between amanitas and agaricus. Amanita in the middle here and agaricus on the left. Agaricus will not generally have a cup at the base. Some weird species may have some structural stuff going on towards the base of the stalk, but they don't really grow in a cup or a vulva. You have to dig underground to see this, which brings up the point that if you are digging up a mushroom to identify, you actually need to go below ground to make sure you can see if there's a vulva or not at the base of the stalk. That is one way to try to avoid amanitas. Now, these features can wear away, so you have to be careful. You can't just rely on that as one feature to tell you you're safe or not. Another way that veil remnants may show up is exemplified by this lovely fly agaric in the upper right. So you're seeing these warts or patches on the cap, on the red cap. These white patches are also what's left of the universal veil. Now again, these can wash off with weather, with rain. And then sometimes we'll see scales on a mushroom, like this funky looking floccularia here on the bottom right, beautiful yellow and white mushroom. So there are all sorts of other structural features that are used to identify different species of mushrooms and to differentiate amongst different species of mushrooms. And then another picture that's kind of cool is exemplifying bruising. So mushrooms, some mushrooms will bruise or stain when you handle them, whether you cut them or poke at them or squeeze them. So what you're looking at here is a cross section of the cap of saffron milky cap or Lactarius deliciosus here in the Rockies. Now, what we're calling Lactarius deliciosus in North America is likely going to wind up being a different species than the Lactarius deliciosus in Europe, and I'm not going to get into that regardless. This is a lovely kind of peach colored mushroom, tan to peach, that's really common around here, and it stains a blue-green color. So the slice on the left is the same exact slice as the one on the right. I just let the one on the right, I just let the slice sit around for a while and took a picture later on, so you can really see that staining progressing on the right-hand side. But you're already seeing it start on the left just from me handling it and cutting the stalk off. So pretty cool. This is an extreme example of staining. So many different species of mushrooms Lactarius, certain types of boletes, for instance, will have a staining reaction and will stain, or probably bruising is a more accurate descriptor of that, will have a bruising reaction. That is a particular color. That is another way to identify that particular mushroom. Some mushrooms don't do this at all. Now, again, you can't rely on this by itself as a 100% positive idea of your mushroom. You use this together with all the other stuff I just dragged you through in identifying a mushroom. And you might be feeling a little overwhelmed at this point if you've made it this far, but just focus on learning one mushroom at a time. You don't have to learn everything out there. It is a good idea to know the toxic ones in your area, but really just focus on one thing at a time. Whether it's an edible mushroom or not, learn how to identify it, learn how to use these different things to identify it, and we're going to move on from here. Other key aspects to identifying a mushroom is where it's growing. If you're looking for a chanterelle in your backyard and you live in Cincinnati, you're going to be out of luck. So the habitat is important to be aware of when looking for a particular mushroom. Where does it grow in terms of elevation? Where does it grow in terms of vegetation? Does it grow in association with a certain tree, for instance? Boletes around here, just as an example, are often found associated with various conifers up in the mountains. Is the mushroom something that's found in the grass or on wood? So that's another aspect of mushroom identification. That, of course, by itself isn't sufficient for ID, but in combination with these other things that I'm talking about is yet another point to consider. Along these lines, when the mushroom is fruiting is also important to pay attention to. Coming back down to the chanterelle example, if you are finding it in April, or you're finding something that you think is a chanterelle in April and you live in Colorado, nope, wrong time of year. So time of year and location are also very important parts of making an accurate, positive identification on a mushroom. Now, coming back to looking at things, another important part of mushroom identification, it's actually quite fun, is to make a spore print. And so spores are how mushrooms reproduce. They're kind of like seeds in a way. And they're microscopic. You're going to see some microscope pictures, some micrographs of spores in a moment. But they're microscopic. But what you can do is make what's called a spore print from a mushroom and get millions of those spores piled up on one another. Now you can see what color those spores are, and that can be helpful. That's actually very helpful for helping you to identify a mushroom. For example, when you consider agaricus mushrooms out in the wild, these are the wild cousins of button mushrooms. A lot of them are white. A white cap, a white stalk with a ring around the stalk. Well, some deadly amanitas are also white. A white cap, a white stalk with a ring around the stalk, and there are very obvious distinguishing features if you're paying attention. However, a great way to distinguish these mushrooms is also by spore print, because the amanita that's deadly will have a very light colored or white spore print, and agaricus will have a dark brown spore print. Keep in mind that not all agaricus mushrooms are edible in the wild, but some of them are quite tasty. So spore prints, how you make a spore print is you take your mushroom. Usually this is a mushroom with a cap and a stalk. You pop the stalk off, you put the cap gill side down, or if it's a conch, pore side down, or whatever kind of mushroom it is, you want to put the surface that releases the spores down onto a sheet of paper or aluminum foil. Put a drop of water on the top of that mushroom cap, and then put a bowl over the whole thing. And the reason for the bowl is that spores are really tiny. So even a little bit of a breeze where you're trying to make your spore print can blow those spores away. The drop of water is to try to induce that mushroom to sporulate. Now, depending on when you've harvested that mushroom, it may or may not drop spores for you, but you can get some really cool spore prints when you do this that are also practical. So this is on aluminum foil. If you're in certain mushroom industries, you want to make your spore prints on aluminum foil if you're planning on cultivating the mushrooms. But these are agaricus mushroom spore prints. The one here on the lower corner that's smaller is a different species of agaricus than the one that is larger in the upper corner. But I found them somewhat close to each other up in the mountains. So two different spore prints. You can even see the pattern of gills there. So these are really fun to make. You can even make greeting cards out of spore prints or spore print art. This may or may not show up. This is a printout of a photo I took of an Amanita spore print. And for whatever reason, I did this on a paper bag. It just happened to be the kind of paper I had handy. And what you're seeing are white spores en masse, a white spore print there. I know it's a little difficult to see, but it looks like it's showing up. One more tip on making a spore print would be, if you want to get really clever, is to get a piece of white paper and a piece of dark paper, black for instance, maybe some construction paper. Tape them together and put it tape side down, and then put your mushroom cap or whatever you're trying to spore print halfway on each. Put it in the middle where the white and black papers are connected. And the point to that is, if you're not sure what the spore color is going to be from the mushroom you're printing, if the spores are really light colored, they'll show up on the black paper. If they're really dark colored, they'll show up on the white paper. And so that's a great way to spore print your mushrooms. I often will use just plain old white printing paper depending on what I'm spore printing. I've shown you that I've done it on paper bags before. Aluminum foil is what's done when people are wanting to actually maintain the health of those spores for growing mushrooms. Glass plates are another way people make spore prints. I haven't played around very much with glass. And then for me with my spore prints, I'm not actually trying to grow anything from them. So what I'll do just for teaching purposes and to be able to show these to students is I'll spray them with hairspray very carefully so as not to blow them off of whatever they're stuck to. But I'll just go and do a few treatments with a hairspray or any kind of thing like that, a fixative spray, to try to preserve the spore print so that I can use it when I'm teaching. So there you go, spore prints. Here are the same two agaricus mushrooms from the mountains here. The one on the left is the smaller version, and the one on the right was the bigger mushrooms, and they really did look like different species based on their sizes. It didn't really seem like they were just different ages in terms of the fruiting bodies. But to confirm that, I did the spore prints that I just showed you, but I also looked at their spores under a microscope. Now, most people, when they're out doing mushroom identification, don't go as far as looking at the microscopic structure of spores, but if you are a nerd, this can be helpful. And indeed, these are two different species of local agaricus. When you look at the mushroom on the left, you can see a very smooth spore, like a smooth kind of egg-shaped spore here, and these are just two different microscopic fields from the slide at 1000x, which means we're looking at the spores blown up 1,000-fold in terms of the size. But when we look at the spores from the mushroom on the right, from the agaricus on the right, their shape is noticeably different. They're less egg-shaped, and they have this little small projection kind of towards the end of the spore. And you can see that both in the two spores on the top micrograph, as we would call this picture of the microscopic spores here. And then you can also see one on the spore in the bottom picture as well. So mycologists will measure spore sizes. They'll talk about the structure of these spores in very scientific terms in terms of their shape and any projections and such from them. Whereas looking at the spore print, a bunch of millions and millions of spores en masse, we can really get a sense of the spore color when there's so many of them piled on top of one another. And a lot of guidebooks will go into detail to some extent on this information on the spores, not only the color of the spore print, but some of the nitty-gritty details at the microscopic level. So there you have it, some key steps in mushroom identification. This is not meant to overwhelm you, it's meant to keep you safe, and it's not as horrific as it sounds. So be patient, get some good ID books, read through the text in those ID books to use the different features that I just talked about in making your ID. Thanks for watching.